Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much. There may be a few people that are coming in from outside, but in the interest of time, we've got a fairly packed agenda for this morning. I just want to welcome everyone to the side meeting on advancing the Beijing platform for action through a feminist foreign policy. It's wonderful to see everyone here, and I think hopefully people have been enjoying the conference over the last couple of days. I feel like one of the highlights of any conference like this are the side meetings and the networking that happen. So really delighted that all of you could join us this morning. I'm honored on behalf of the Asia Foundation to welcome you officially to the side event of the Asia Pacific Ministerial Conference on the Beijing +30 review. Today's session is looking at advancing the Beijing platform for action through a feminist foreign policy. It brings together a remarkable partners and allies to discuss how applying a gender lens to foreign policy can direct us towards a more inclusive, equitable, and resilient future. First, I'd like to recognize our co-organizers for today's event. Is the International Women's Development Agency, CREA, the Fiji Women's Rights Movement, Gender and Development Cambodia, the Feminist Foreign Policy Collaborative, and the Generation Equality Forum Action Coalition 6. Each of these organizations is a leader in the movement for gender equality and social justice, and it's a privilege to work with alongside with many of them to explore how a feminist foreign policy can advance the commitments laid out in the Beijing Platform for Action. I'm delighted to support this effort by moderating today's dialogue as part of TAF's commitment to gender equality and inclusive governance. For 70 years, our organization has worked to empower women and girls and marginalized communities from across Asia and the Pacific. We recognize that achieving gender equality is foundational to building stable, prosperous, and just societies. And we are steadfast in our commitment to advancing this vision in partnership with governments, civil society, and grassroots leaders across the region. At the heart of TAF's approach is the belief that gender equality and women's rights are not just domestic concerns. They are fundamental to global stability and cooperation. In our work, we see how gender-responsive policies can contribute to lasting peace and development, and we strive to bring that perspective into all aspects of our programming and partnerships. We're mindful of the importance of international cooperation and solidarity in addressing urgent challenges facing women and girls today. Through our initiatives in areas like economic empowerment, inclusive governance, and digital skills, we aim to create environments where women and marginalized communities can thrive. In recent years, we've deepened our focus on gender, women's political participation, the care economy, leadership, and international cooperation, an approach that emphasizes women's role as leaders and central pillars of foreign policy. A feminist foreign policy framework not only amplifies women's voices, but also challenges traditional power structures and seeks more holistic, compassionate, and effective approaches to diplomacy and international relations. Today, we'll hear from a range of leaders and experts and advocates who are pushing for a feminist foreign policy across the Asia-Pacific region. These policies are more than symbolic. They offer concrete strategies to address the structural inequalities that hinder progress on gender equality. They're about recognizing women's leadership, investing in policies that protect human rights, and holding governments accountable to the commitments they've made. As we gather in this session, it's worth remembering that the Beijing Platform for Action remains one of the most ambitious and comprehensive blueprints for advancing women's rights worldwide. But as we approach the 30th anniversary, it's also clear that progress has been uneven, and in some areas, hard-won gains are at risk. That's why a feminist foreign policy is so crucial, as it strengthens our resolve and unites our efforts to address ongoing challenges with a shared vision for the future. Thank you all for being here today, for your passion and your dedication to the issue, and I look forward to a rich and inspiring discussion. I'm excited to see how our collective insights can help shape a more inclusive and just, equitable world for all. Let's begin. First, I'm very pleased to welcome Lopa Banerjee, the Director of Civil Society Division of UN Women. Lopa leads the UN Women's work on strengthening civil society contribution, participation, and influence in the global intergovernmental policy discussion and decision processes. She's a gender and human rights expert with 3 decades of experience in social policy and governance issues across Asia and Africa. And Lopa's going to speak to the global perspective on feminist foreign policy and UN women's interests in the emerging agenda. Thank you very much, Lopa.
Thank you very much, Pauline. Good morning, friends, and greetings to all online. I saw Fotani's name come up, so warm greetings to all of the activists and leaders online, and warm greetings to all of you. You're absolutely right, Pauline. The menu of side events at in these spaces, and I speak from several years of leading the CSW in New York, that the menu of side events is what makes these intergovernmental discussions so interesting. And so it's my great pleasure and delight to be here this morning and to talk about feminist foreign policy, which is crucial, of course, at this point in time as we review the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, but overall at this point in time when we are seeing the scale of conflict and geopolitical fragmentation in the world today. And this issue of feminist foreign policy is a central focus for UN Women, for the Generation Equality overall, and in particular the Action Coalition 6. But it's also a topic that is very close to my heart at a personal level. Pauline, you spoke about how important the Beijing platform remains today, 30 years after its, nearly 30 years after its adoption. And indeed, it remains a crucial political compact. And that's what makes it so visionary and so critical in today's context, because it was a political decision. It's a political compact adopted by governments and laying out the framework for their accountability, together with other constituencies, of course, but fundamentally it is a standard setting and standard implementation framework. And in that way, it foresaw the framing of the feminist foreign policy discussions, because the platform itself focused on crucial issues that at that point in time were not necessarily considered part of the gender equality agenda before Beijing came along, before the platform was adopted. For example, issues of disarmament, issues around environmental sustainability, the role of media in terms of shaping national political discourse. And so in many ways, the Platform for Action lays out the framing of a feminist foreign policy discussion. And therefore, today, at its 30th year review, this connection is so crucial as we look at those countries that are taking the feminist foreign policy forward. And thank you very much, Mongolia, for your leadership on this. We know the environment in which we are operating today. The scale of war, the scale of assault on women's and girls' rights, the deep insecurities, the profound inequalities, the shrinking of democratic space. Women and girls are suffering the consequences of these insecurities and conflict. 1 in 5 girls is still getting married before the age of 18 across the world. In many countries across the world, women do not have basic access to bodily autonomy, to sexual and reproductive health. The foundations of planetary ecosystems are threatened by the collective impact of multiple environment crises. And most importantly, in the context of this discussion, parity and women's leadership in public life remains elusive. Added to that, the scale of violence and discrimination against women and girls. And while all of these challenges persist, the resources to invest in women's and girls' rights are diminishing. But the glass is also half full. UN Women's latest SDG Gender Snapshot talks about the fact that we are seeing a decline in female poverty. We have seen a reducing gender gap in education, and there are many countries that are pushing for positive legal reforms. But this is still progress that is slow, that is sluggish, and with only 6 years to go till 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goal agenda deadline, we are not anywhere near achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And the promise of Beijing remains unfulfilled. And so as we mark the 30th anniversary year, to look at how the feminist foreign policy framework continues or amplifies and accelerates putting women's rights at the forefront of international relations and diplomacy is a crucial piece. The Beijing Platform for Action, in its framing, understood that gender inequality, it contributes to national insecurity. And that aspect is something that we need to be looking at within the feminist foreign policy framework. The feminist foreign policy framework is a fantastic achievement in the years since Beijing was adopted. However, there is a chasm between the ambition of the ways in which the feminist foreign policy notion was set up and its achievement today. Feminist foreign policies have not advanced the needle enough in inclusive decision-making for women in leadership positions, in particular in multilateral spaces, in national politics, in international politics. And so that focus on meaningful, inclusive women's leadership and decision-making has to be a key focus of feminist foreign policy leaders and countries that are driving this. Second, the aspects around war and conflict and the manner in which feminist foreign policy needs to address this. This has been a huge gap, in particular in the context of the wars we are seeing in the world today. The fact that transformative peace building should be a fundamental goal that nations seek in their bilateral relations, in their multilateral relations, and of course as a key national priority. And the focusing feminist foreign policy discussions on that within not only multilateral spaces, but in bilateral discussions is a centerpiece of this. Particularly now, this year, in 2024, when we have seen this year of mega elections and almost 4 billion people going to the polls, and new governments that have emerged in different countries, this is a time when we call on member states to therefore use this moment of democratic democratic energy to safeguard the gains made, but to push for the gains yet unmet, so that the policy shifts at national, regional, and international levels are aligned with international standards that the feminist foreign policy agenda needs to advance. Let me conclude by talking a bit about UN Women's contribution to this agenda. As I mentioned, UN Women supports member states to advance gender-responsive, feminist-centered foreign policies that are promoting equality, justice, and rights in adherence with the commitments that member states have made on this in terms of our work, our triple mandate on addressing the normative, the coordination work that we do, and the operational work that we do. And our work on advancing feminist foreign policy with governments is based on three key pillars. The first is on looking at data, evidence, and knowledge. The generation of new data and documentation of success stories and good practices that both help to bridge the knowledge gaps, that highlight the connections between gender equality and the various domains of foreign policy. And the second pillar is representation. And I cannot emphasize this enough. The promotion of increased representation and leadership, inclusive leadership, which includes looking intentionally at structurally excluded constituency groups among women, women with disabilities, indigenous women, LGBTI women, refugee and migrant constituencies, to be able to push for the standards that are necessary to ensure that there is constituency representation that is comprehensive in women's leadership. And the third is to looking at the integration of gender equality in all areas of foreign policy, including foreign policy design and implementation. And in collaboration and partnership with member states, we have operationalized work across these three pillars in Colombia, Bolivia, Moldova, North Macedonia, and Liberia, in partnership with the Ministries of Foreign Affairs and in close coordination with the national gender machineries. And the idea is to look at some of these good practices to be able to expand this to other geographical regions. And so at this point in time, let me conclude by saying that it is our hope, and more importantly, it is the demand that we saw over these last few days here, but not only here, across the world, that activists, those that are at the front line of the gender equality and women's rights agenda are demanding accountability. They are demanding accountability from those of us who are in policy-making spaces. And the feminist foreign policy agenda is a crucial measure of delivering this accountability. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussions.
Lopa, thank you very much for that. And I couldn't agree more about meaningful, inclusive women's leadership in all of those spaces. Now I'd like to introduce Ambassador Amarsanaa, my apologies on your last name, who's the ambassador of Mongolia to the Kingdom of Thailand and also the permanent representative to the international organizations in Bangkok. He's been with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for over 20 years, including as Director General covering international law and treaty and international legal affairs. Following the ambassador's remarks, we'll also go straight to a video presentation from María Cristina Perceval, who's the Senior Fellow at the Feminist Foreign Policy Collaborative and President of Feminists Without Borders. Maria was previously the Special Representative for Feminist Foreign Policy of Argentina, and she'll speak to us about the 2023 High-Level Regional Meeting on Feminist Foreign Policy for Latin America and the Caribbean. And with that, I'd like to invite the ambassador up. Thank you very much.
Honorable panelists, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to participate in this important panel to share our perspectives and commitment to advancing women's rights through foreign policy, especially in light of the recently adopted Pact for the Future, which underscores the global commitment to achieving gender equality and empowering all women. According to the World Economic Forum, the global gender gap scores in 2024 stands at 68.5%, and at the current rate of progress, it will take 131 years to reach full gender parity, 5 generations beyond the 2030 target for gender equality under the SDGs. Despite long-standing efforts and significant progress through various programs and initiatives, women continue to be underrepresented in the decision-making process and face persistent discrimination, hindering further progress towards equality. Mongolia has a proud legacy as being one of the first Asian countries to legislate gender equality. Since 1924, women's right to vote and to be elected has been enshrined in our constitution, and followed by other civil rights, including the rights to work, education, and political participation in the legal framework. The government has adopted various gender equality frameworks and policies towards promoting gender equality and empowering women across various sectors. To ensure women's participation in foreign policy, Mongolia adopted several laws and policies aimed at addressing gender equality and women's rights. For example, the law on the promotion of gender equality that ensures equal opportunities and rights for men and women in politics, economics, culture, and social spheres. It includes provisions against gender-based discrimination and promotes gender-sensitive policymaking. Another crucial document is National Program on Gender Equality. This program outlined strategies for increasing women's participation in decision-making, reducing gender-based violence, and promoting economic empowerment for women. Another document is Cross-Sectoral Strategic Plan for Promoting Gender Equality that was adopted recently in 2022. The recently launched 10-year document underlines our commitment to cohesive national approach in tackling gender inequality. Its objective is to sustain these achievements by fostering multi-sectoral coordination and partnerships and aligning with Mongolia's long-term development vision 2050 to achieve the SDGs. Of course, I have to mention about women's representation. Women hold an important role in our history and political and social spheres. We have made notable progress in women political participation, having increased in women leadership in politics and diplomacy. In our last parliamentary election held in June this year, out of 126 members of the parliament, 32 women were elected, raising female representation to 25.4%, setting a new high for the Asia-Pacific region and approaching the global average. This gender quota will raise to 40% by 2028 parliamentary elections, potentially further boosting women's representation. While changes remain, there is a growing representation of women in decision-making roles, and we continue to advocate for inclusive governance and social development. So these legal documents and political representations is to promote women's participation in the foreign policy in my country. Now let me underscore some activities that we are working on to develop in the participation of women in the foreign policy. We have made significant strides in promoting gender equality both domestically and internationally last few years. For instance, Mongolia initiated and hosted 3 consecutive international conferences: Women in Peacekeeping in 2022, the Female Foreign Ministers Meeting in 2023, and the World Women's Forum this year, August this year. These pioneering events in Asia brought together representatives from different regions, advancing the role of women in multilateral relations, peace and security, social development, and green futures, and inspiring women and girls globally. I would like to highlight the World Women's Forum held in August 2022 to 2023 this year in Ulaanbaatar, under the auspices of the President of Mongolia and within the framework of 100th anniversary of Mongolian Women's Union. The forum brought together around 800 women leaders, including high-level officials, representatives from government and non-governmental organizations, civil society activists, and Mongolian women leaders from various sectors. During the forum, 6 thematic discussions were held on topics such as women's role in addressing climate change, food security, green and digital economies, and their contribution to education, sport, arts, and culture. The forum concluded with the adoption of the Ulaanbaatar Declaration. This declaration is a forward-looking outcome document that reflects Mongolia's commitment to gender equality and contributes to global discussions on the gender dimensions of the 2030 Agenda, the Summit of the Future, and Beijing 30 among others. Lastly, I would like to close with a message from UN Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed, delivered during her closing remarks at the World Women's Forum in Mongolia. States that our world is calling for bold and transformative change. Together, let us answer that call by building a future that is more just, more equitable, and more equal for all, championed by women's leadership. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Wonderful to hear about a century of commitments from Mongolia to women's equality. And with that, we'll turn to the video.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in this important activity as a fellow of Feminist Foreign Policy Collaborative, a distinction that honors me. Women in Diplomacy Index found that in 2023, only 25% of ambassadors and permanent representatives in our region are women. If we look Asia, the reality is not very different. In this region, 12% of ambassadors are women. In front of this, FFP understands that it is imperative to make visible the power relations within the foreign ministries, which could mostly be considered as gentlemen's clubs, where gentlemen's agreements conceived by gentlemen prevail. The CEDAW Committee, within its mandate, has elaborated a new General Recommendation 40. The committee considers that the achievement of parity as a fundamental human right requires systematic action. However, we are aware FFP is not just about numbers. With my colleagues from Collaborative, we agreed to share with you today the genesis of the Latin American Network for FFP, the defined strategy and some of its results, since convictions without policies are ephemeral and policies without strategies are empty. Arriving at the formation of the Latin America Intersectoral Network of Feminist Foreign Policy in September 2023 was a multi-step strategy, and despite its light and dark sides, it was decidedly solid and innovative. Latin America and the Caribbean has its own regional gender agenda, which has been consolidated over the last 45 years through commitments made at the ICLAC Regional Conference on Women in LAC. In 2022, in a context of cascading international crises, the growing challenges posed by the digital revolution, climate change, biodiversity loss, desertification, geopolitical shocks, extremely low economic growth, and the high level of public debt in many countries in the region, high inflation rates, the accumulation of fiscal deficit in addition to deepening the structural challenges of gender inequality, threaten the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030. The most pressing issues are not totally different from those addressed in the past, however, the context was not the same. From 10 to 11 November 2022, in Buenos Aires took place the 15th Regional Conference on Women of ECLAC and organized by the government of Argentina. At that moment, I was Secretary of State of Equality and Diversity, having the responsibility to coordinate the conference and negotiate the declaration. The agreement, reached and approved unanimously, was the Buenos Aires commitment. It took on special relevance because the progress achieved at global and regional levels were threatened by the emergence of authoritarian regimes, new forms of racism, misogyny, negationism, and an unprecedented increase in hate speech and political violence, particularly against women and feminist organizations, LGBTIQ+ people, human rights defenders, environmental activists, Afro and indigenous communities, among others. The Buenos Aires commitment charts, from a human rights approach and a feminist perspective, a path towards a queer society with economic, social, and environmental sustainability at the center. At the end of the conference, all of us understood that it became essential to make the Buenos Aires commitment a reality, not doing more of the same, but proposing a transformative, innovative, inclusive, and feminist agenda, recreate and establish broad alliances, and use all the tools at our disposal. Clearly, FFP was one of them, if not the most relevant. This required organizing ourselves in a powerful network, firstly at the national level, but then with other countries of the region. The first step, once organized the national chapter of this network, we co-create a proposal in order to request to the highest authorities of Argentina the creation of a special representation for FFP with the rank of Secretary of State. The second step was that the representation was created in January 2023. Feminist organizations proposed that I assume the responsibility. From the beginning, we worked in an intersectional, pluricultural, and inclusive dynamic, including the participation of civil society, academia, scientific organizations, unions, the private sector, the United Nations system, international feminist organizations, among which collaborative played a central role. In March, the 67th session of the CSW was to take place. We consider that we have to be there, not as an isolated country, but as a cooperative region. The objectives were to present the Buenos Aires commitment and its contribution to multilateralism, and expand our alliances and promote a dialogue with FFP countries inside and out of the region. At this point, we made key decisions. We began to actively participate in the FFP Policy Plus group created by Sweden and Spain in 2021 to promote gender transformative and feminist approaches to foreign policy, exchange experiences and proposals, and agree on common positions. We understood that it was necessary to include the critical perspective of the Latin America and the global South feminism. We finally created in September the intersectoral FFP regional network, and a few days later we went to New York to present our plan of action in the margins of the main period of the 78th session of the United Nations General Assembly. The idea of a regional network had been consolidated. The network was made up of representatives from the foreign ministries, feminist organizations, and academic institutions of Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Chile, and Mexico as full members, because in 2023 they were the countries that had adopted or were in the process of implementing FFP with representatives from UN system agencies for support and technical assistance, with representatives from the foreign ministries of Canada, Spain, Germany, and the Netherlands as guest members, and invited to imagine ways of open exchange and horizontal cooperation, with representatives from international intergovernmental organizations such as the European Union LAC Foundation and non-governmental organizations such as Collaborative. The intersectoral, plural, and multi-country nature of this strategy responded to political and operational criteria. Beyond the fact that FFP is a sovereign decision and a differential responsibility of governments once adopted, it is not their exclusive property. If the government of a country decides, as happened in Sweden years ago and brutally now in my country, Argentina, if a government of a country decides to dismantle gender mechanisms or abandon the paradigm of a feminist foreign policy, that country is not entirely annulled because representatives of its civil society, academia, and other organizations can be active protagonists of citizen diplomacy mechanisms and make their voices heard in international fora and instances. To be at the same table means that civil society organizations must stop being seen as mere receptacles of funds, which are scarce, by the way, to be called upon as co-creators of multi-scalar and sustainable policies. But at the same time, these organizations can play a key role in international discussion by influencing governmental decisions and bringing issues to the international attention. The academic sector can play a key role in the generation of knowledge, critical vision, and in the exchange of reliable and secure data systems. At the same time, the inclusion of diverse grammars and scripts other than those developed by Western-centric critical theory should be valorized. The presence of the UN system contributes to ensuring that our national and regional agendas have an impact on the international community and that the deliberation of the affairs of the international community form part of our concerns and decisions and bring sustainability to different initiatives. The active presence of countries from other regions contributes to bringing the gaps that have deepened in recent times between North and South, East and West, etc., and helps to take on shared challenges around global common goods and to work on a common agenda under the principles of solidarity, cooperation, and common but differentiated responsibilities. The inspiration of international organizations like Collaborative is fundamental for building bridges among governments and feminist organizations, countries, regions, and cultures.
Wonderful to hear about the experience from a different region in working on feminist foreign policy, and I think really important some of the issues that Maria mentioned in terms of what happens when a government decides to change directions, and the role of civil society and academia and other partners in continuing to advance that discussion. And with that, I'd like to invite our panelists up. First, we have Chandy, who's the Executive Director of Gender and Development for Cambodia. Chandy's a feminist who has been working in the gender equality movement for more than 10 years and is a member of the Committee for ASEAN People Forum. Thank you. Yes. And next, we have Nalini Singh, who's a feminist and social development specialist with over 20 years experience in women's rights in Asia and the Pacific. She is the Executive Director of Fiji Women's Rights Movement and a leading feminist human rights organization that links local concerns to global debates. And finally, we have Alice Ridge, who is the Senior Research and Policy Advocacy Advisor at the International Women's Development Agency based in Australia. Alice leads IWDA's work on feminist foreign policy, including research on global trajectories of FFP and commitments. We've had a rich framing discussion this morning about some of the global perspectives, some of the progress that we've had in terms of gender equality globally, and specifically in Mongolia, as well as from the other region. But with that, maybe Alice, I'll start with you first. And can you tell us a little bit more about the recent research on the global picture for feminist foreign policy?
Thank you, and thank you so much to Lopa and the Ambassador of Mongolia and Ambassador Perceval for their remarks so far. For those who aren't familiar with IWDA, we are a feminist organisation based in Australia, providing funding and other support to women's rights organisations in Asia and the Pacific and working with feminist movements globally. We also convene the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition, which I have some postcards for at the front, as well as our podcast on feminist and First Nations foreign policy. And I'd really encourage you to check it out because we have lots of fantastic resources on FFP, which are relevant not just for Australians, but really for everyone who's interested in this space. So we've been working on feminist foreign policy since about 2017, because we see it as an approach which can help to grapple with and ultimately transform the structures of power that shape the world today, including patriarchy, but also structures like colonialism, militarism, capitalism, and others. And at the same time, as has been alluded to by our speakers, we know that feminist foreign policy, as it is practiced by governments, has often fallen short of this transformative potential. And in fact, to be a little bit provocative, I would say FFP today is facing a reckoning. The research that I wanted to speak about focuses on the trajectories that different governments have taken to adopting feminist foreign policy. And my organisation first conducted this research in 2020, looking at the pathways taken by Sweden, Canada, France, and Mexico as 4 of the early adopters of feminist foreign policy. And what we found amongst that first wave was that governments saw feminist foreign policy as a way to stand out on the global stage. So Sweden was the first in the world. Canada and France both adopted when they were chairing the G7, and Mexico when it was co-hosting the Generation Equality Forum. So it was really a way to sort of stand out on the global stage, obviously amongst a range of other values-based and pragmatic factors, but this was really key. Since 2020, there have been many more, now up to about 14 governments who have at some point committed to take a feminist approach. And this year we updated our research to see what has changed since that first wave. And what we've found is that FFP is no longer about standing out, it's about fitting in. It's about signalling values alignment with other countries who are taking this approach, working through multilateral systems and applying a values base to their foreign policy. We have the FFP Plus group, which has been mentioned already, of countries who have or are considering or aligned to feminist approaches in their foreign policy. And Mongolia is, of course, part of this group in New York. And we're also starting to see regional groupings, which Ambassador Perceval spoke about in Latin America, which is really an important way of defining feminist foreign policy in ways that are contextually relevant to different parts of the world. So, where Sweden had the 3 R's of rights, representation, and resources, what we see in Latin America is Colombia centering the principle of pacifism, and Chile centering economic justice as part of their feminist foreign policies. So really defining the principles that are most important to their region. And while this growth in FFPs might seem like the concept is booming, what we found in our research this year is that after a decade of feminist foreign policy, the concept is facing a bit of an existential crisis. Sweden had a change of government and dropped their commitment, as has Argentina and the Netherlands. France and Spain narrowly missed changes in government in their most recent elections, and several more countries' commitments are seen as vulnerable. But the real kicker is that these changes in government haven't just affected the most ambitious or transformative parts of a feminist foreign policy agenda, but because many countries are labeling their foreign policy as feminist, but then largely carrying on business as usual, doing gender mainstreaming, a bit of gender funding through ODA, some women's leadership, representation work, which is all really important. I don't want to undermine how important those issues are, but they are, things of consensus that go back to 1995 or even further. They're not really progressive, transformative elements of feminist foreign policy. And the risk we're seeing is that when this radical label is applied to approaches that are really consensus, those issues are being tied up with what is seen as a more radical agenda, making them more vulnerable to winding back when we see significant changes in government. The other factor, which we've also alluded to this morning, is the way in which many FFP governments and some prominent civil society organizations have failed in their response to Israel's war on Gaza. And I want to emphasize, this isn't all FFP countries. The response has been really diverse across the different governments who hold this approach. But the failure, especially of minority world countries, has been a real flashpoint, with feminist civil society calling out the hypocrisy of naming a feminist approach and then failing to stand up for those principles. So just to finish off, to bring it back to this part of the world, I think there is immense potential in these approaches for governments in Asia and the Pacific. But what we've found in our research is if they want to learn from the shortcomings of other governments, it can't just be a new name for a gender equality approach. It really needs to adopt the label of feminism. We really need to go beyond and take more transformative actions.
Alice, thank you very much for those remarks. Sobering, also potentially some opportunities. And with that, I'd like to come back to this region and into ASEAN. And Chandy, ask you, can you share your perspective on where there might be opportunities for a feminist approach to foreign policy here in ASEAN as well as Cambodia?
Thank you for the question and good morning, everyone. Like the ambassador said, we might spend like 5 more generations to reach the gender equality, but with the feminist foreign policy, we might not need to 5 generations, right? Because we have so many capable leaders and those who care about feminist foreign policy are sitting in this room and also outside of this as our allies. I want to explore the intersect between ASEAN regions, plan of action on women, peace and security, Cambodia foreign policy, and the transformative potential of the feminist foreign policy in Southeast Asia. So let's look at the word foreign policy itself. I had the very interesting discussion with relevant people back home regarding the word foreign policy. So a lot of people would say the word foreign policy refer to state security, refer to how state is the directions that state have the connections, engagements, or interact with other state and also non-state actors. So how can we put the word feminist into feminist foreign policy, into foreign policy? And then one of my colleagues would just say, well, the word feminist, and when we put in the feminist foreign policy, it means that we are trying to make sure there is no gender inequality and also dismantle male dominance and patriarchy. And that's how the conversation ends. And that rings a bell into his mind all the time. Dismantle male dominant? Should we continue talking about feminist foreign policy then? But later on, when we explain about the principle of feminist to those relevant people, we found out that it is very interesting to talk about. And a lot of states that we're talking with, the word feminist itself rather be a concept more than a concept and beyond the concept. So those kind of things have been applied into our foreign policy. Let's begin with the word ASEAN itself. So we all know that ASEAN consists of 10 states in these regions. Timor-Leste is coming in, so we will have 11 states. But with that 10 states, when we say the word ASEAN, we do not include stateless. We are not including migrant workers who migrate from other parts to live in Southeast Asia. So rather than for us, when we talk about ASEAN, we talk about Southeast Asia. We talk about Southeast Asia people and those who live in Southeast Asia. In ASEAN blueprint, it plays a very important role in promoting regional integration, stability, and economic growth. So Cambodia is one of the ASEAN member. In this point, Cambodia also reflects with the balance between safeguarding national sovereignty and striving for economic growth. So when we talk about the national security, are we also talking about individual citizen people in this Southeast Asia security? and also in our country's security. So this brings us to family foreign policy. Family foreign policy challenge traditional diplomacy and placing inclusive, equality, and human rights at its core. And that's how we translate the word family foreign policy to the relevant decision maker in Cambodia. So we asked them about how you can integrate feminists into the foreign policy of Cambodia. So Cambodia have 5 kind of like strategic. When we talk about foreign policy, there are 5 kind of directions here. First one is talking about protection of national independence and sovereignty. Of course, every country in the world would protect national independence and sovereignty. But did we talk about women's security needs such as protection from gender-based violence or ensuring inclusive peacekeeping force of like women's and also other people, relevant marginalized people? Whether we are fully consider this into the protection of national independence and sovereignty in our foreign policy. Second is the fostering friendship abroad. We cannot live alone. ASEAN is the same. We cannot have only 10 countries and working with each other non-stop, not working with other countries, right? But that relationship, whether we ask the question, how often are women's voice included in this relationship, not to mention about other vulnerable groups. Here, family foreign policy push for accountability using Cambodia to hold other nations responsible for their treatment for women, even if it means addressing sensitive issues diplomatically. So that brings back the issue of Rohingya happening in Southeast Asia, happening in ASEAN. Whether Cambodia are taking some kind of actions on that, do we address about gender-based violence across the country in Southeast Asia? Are we, because of the word fostering friendship abroad, we are not taking care of what's happening on women's, LGBTQI people, stateless people in other countries? Third is about the economic diplomacy. And again, economic diplomacy is kind of a very important talking about foreign policy, and it's true. But we also have to integrate gender dynamic into trade agreement. And we also have to ask the question how global trade and investment agreement actively address gender equality, worker rights, or gender-based wage gaps. 4, support the multilateralism. We heard from Lopa, we heard from Ambassador, and we heard from Pauline when she did the open sharing, and also from Alice about that word multilateralism. Cambodia support for multilateral efforts like UN peacekeeping, those kind of things. But we have to emphasize inclusive of women in peace process, ensuring their voice. Those kind of things we have to put. And the last one, enhancing the capacity of Cambodian diplomats, not just only Cambodian, but also other countries. Ambassador mentioned about number of females in decision maker in the parliamentarian. How about in the diplomacy? How about the way we talk with each other abroad? Those kind of things. So Cambodia, we have 20, so far we have 27 ambassadors in the globe, and there are only 5 females in the ambassador. So consists of, if we talk about the percentage, is 19%. And that the global say like, oh, you are reaching more than 15% already. But this is not enough. We need to do it more. So talking back with the ASEAN, we do not see it as a short journey that Southeast Asia could push for family foreign policy, not to mention Cambodia, because there will be taking times, but not 5 generations, of course. So we would consider about cultural and political resistance. We have to thinking about institutional capacity. We also had to see about the positive mindset, because in 2022, when Cambodia hosted ASEAN, we pushed for the agenda of the Women, Peace and Security called ASEAN Regional Plan of Action on Women, Peace and Security. So from that agenda of Women, Peace and Security, it's a very good light and also good journey for Southeast Asia or ASEAN itself, pushing for family foreign policy. So starting from starting from Women, Peace and Security agenda and that action plan, we can of course pushing for family foreign policy happening in this region. Thank you.
Chandy, thank you so much. And I think that those percentages are stark. It's interesting when we give a percentage versus an actual number. It's impressive when you say 19%, but when you say only 5 females in as ambassador, that's not very many. Excellent. With that, I'd like to turn to Nalini. What do you see as opportunities for Fiji as a small island nation in terms of moving towards a feminist foreign policy approach?
Bulavinaka, everyone. Warm Pacific greetings to everyone. I'm so delighted to be on this panel. My wonderful friend Chandy, who's spoken really powerfully, and Alice, of course, with all the research. You might be wondering why Fiji, such a small country, we're not a donor country. Yes, we might be in the limelight for signing on to international conventions really quickly, but what do I have to say about a feminist foreign policy with Fiji? But recently, Fiji released its white paper on Fiji's foreign policy for the first time, and that got us excited. We did a very quick feminist analysis of that white paper, and of course, it led into the already ongoing conversations that we were having with IWDA, Alice, and others in the region and globally around, so what does it mean for small island countries? What we see now, of course, being very small, what kind of unique opportunities, we could have to adopt a foreign policy that, could look at strengthening our, influence, promote inclusivity, and position ourselves as regional leaders on gender equality and human rights. However, with the recent release of the white paper on Fiji's foreign policy, in the development of such policies, we find that it's imperative that women in all their diversities must be consulted, in its development process, and that was significantly lacking. We didn't even know about it until it was released. Otherwise, it just joins the plethora of documents that is created, and no one in the country is aware of it. Then how do you actually act on it? How do you monitor it and hold the government to account? And also when we're examining foreign relations and domestic policies, we see that the intersection with women's rights, that is, an opportunity in gender equality, especially around peace building and security efforts in the Pacific region. So those of us who are looking at regionalism and peace and security in the region, and my Pacific colleagues here, know that there's a significant amount of conversation that goes into looking at the geopolitics and security discussions. The opportunities that exist, I think, one is around the climate leadership with a gender lens. Fiji's frontline experience with climate change, offers us a very unique opportunity to lead, globally on climate policies that incorporate gender perspectives. Very apt because COP, is going on now, and what we have found, those of us who follow, that gender, doesn't take mainstream, in terms of discussions. Policies are often very, very gender neutral. And we all know this, that, and we don't, when we keep reiterating it, and it keeps happening, that, policies are very gender neutral. And we know that gender neutral policies are not gender responsive. So we do need feminist policies that would prioritize women's roles in climate resilience building, advocating for inclusive environmental solutions that protect and empower those that are most affected, particularly women in the indigenous communities. Second is around peace building and regional stability. Building on what Chandy has said, Fiji, we think, can leverage its reputation as a peacekeeper. We, ever since I've known, have been sending troops into regions that, have ongoing, security, war situations, and we have been providing that service via the UN, and to advocate for regional stability by championing peace processes that also, could prioritize women's voices and participation. That could strengthen regional security efforts and enhance Fiji's diplomatic standing by supporting gender-inclusive governance models across the Pacific. And of course, we feminists are very, very critical and very cognizant of the fact of the role that our own military has played in country in the creation of political instability every so often. The third would be around promoting economic empowerment and social equity. By integrating feminist approaches, Fiji could influence trade and development agreements that support women's economic empowerment, fair labor standards, social protection as well. So emphasizing gender-responsive aid, financial access, and skills building initiatives would not only enhance economic resilience, but also address gender disparities across the region, including women in leadership, as we heard earlier on. And this could also work towards ensuring that there are more gender-responsive policies around what we have now in the Pacific, which is the labor mobility schemes coming in after COVID, where we are grappling to understand the whole dynamics of, Fiji is now a country that is sending migrant workers across and receiving migrant workers in country. So we are in a very unique position right now, and so some thinking around that would be good. The fourth would be around strengthening alliances and international influence. A feminist foreign policy would align Fiji with growing number of countries that we heard earlier. And that approach would allow Fiji to build strategic alliances, attract foreign investment, and gain increased support for sustainable development initiatives by showcasing, our commitment for human rights and equality, at least of what we have on paper, and having some pressure on itself to do better, and finally showcasing the Pacific way. What we've been hearing from the last from Tuesday, the Pacific way, or the cultural leadership around gender equality. The Pacific is unique. Things would work if it is adapted into our ways, which means that looking at our rich cultural diversity and long-standing community-centered values, and by promoting a feminist foreign policy that respects and builds on cultural strengths, we could inspire other nations, other smaller nations, to pursue equitable approaches in ways that respect traditional values while still advancing gender equality as per what is in our international commitments and domestic documents as well.
Thank you so much, Nalini, for unpacking feminist or foreign policy and what does it mean for Fiji. We have a couple of minutes if we have questions either from the room or online. I think there's one online. Why don't do you want to read the one online first, and then we'll go to this one, and then we'll ask the panelists to respond to both questions at the same time.
Great, so we have a question online from Dia Nag, who asks, some of the presenters have touched on this, but it would be great to hear more from the speakers about how feminist foreign policy frameworks might enable increased climate resilience, particularly amongst underserved populations.
And if you can just turn your mic on. Thank you.
Thank you. My question is, I guess maybe across the Asia Pacific region, but in particular the Pacific, we've seen the geopolitical tensions, I guess, with between the states and I guess China. This dynamic that's been playing out is really there's been a huge focus on the Pacific. Has that led to any impact on government's willingness to adopt actual feminist foreign policies, or has that just been neutral?
Thank you. I can speak to that last question. In regards to Australia, what the Australian government has done is commit to a First Nations approach to foreign policy. And I think that's a direct response to the current government's eagerness to build strong relationships with the Pacific and a recognition that for Pacific Islanders, they see Australia as a colonial country, which it is. It was also about integrating the Uluru Statement from the Heart into foreign policy. That statement has 3 pillars around voice, treaty and truth. And unfortunately, we held a referendum a little over 12 months ago on the voice to Parliament, which failed, which was extremely disappointing. But what the government has done is implement that First Nations approach to foreign policy. So they've appointed a First Nations ambassador, Justin Mohammed, who is really taking that work forward. And I think it's really strongly aligned with a feminist foreign policy approach. It's not exactly the same. I think the really important difference with First Nations foreign policy is that First Nations people are nations. They are sovereign nations who interact and engage in foreign policy, both with the colonial state, with other First Nations on the Australian continent, and First Nations groups elsewhere, which I think is a really important difference to feminist foreign policy. Women are in solidarity with one another, but we are not a nation in the same way. But I think there's a lot to kind of learn across those two approaches. And I will just plug our podcast, which is on this topic. It's called EFIT, Feminist and First Nations Approaches to Foreign Policy. And we interviewed Justin Mohammed. The host of that podcast is Julie Balangari, who's an incredible First Nations woman from Australia. So yes, in terms of the geopolitics, I think what it has directly opened up is this First Nations approach to foreign policy from Australia. But Nalini might like to comment on the region.
I just want to respond with the first question regarding the climate issue and how can family foreign policy also can deal with that. So this is in Southeast Asia only, right? So in Southeast Asia, for the ASEAN Regional Plan of Action on Women, Peace and Security, first time that they recognize climate change is a new threat of and can create conflict and also harm to the peace and security. So in this sense, we can feel that using the ASEAN Regional Plan of Actions on Women, Peace and Security to push for the climate adaptations, kind of like work and also budgeting, working on the climate issues would be the very good kind of like door and also framework for us it can be a tool for us to use and deal with the climate issues and put it that can be relevant to women, peace and security in these regions. I would answer that. Thank you.
So the question around the geopolitics in the Pacific, it's a complex one, but in Fiji's foreign policy, we don't see overt references to those type of situations, and our what shall I say, reaction or relation has been of being friends with everybody, but then the subtle messaging is always there with the bigger trading partners, the bigger, shall I say, friends that they have. So they have all, friends of scale. So if we were to apply a feminist foreign policy to that, then is what Chandy is saying, we're bringing back the women, peace and security lens, and that would involve, ensuring that everyone, including women, are consulted. We put on our key issues in there, and then it will involve examining, for example, the kinds of investments that are currently going on in the region and in my country as well, in terms of building military bases. Do we need that kind of investment? Why do we need that? Where's the threat coming from? We are looking at those issues and wondering, why do we have to have that? What are we preparing our region for? So beyond trade, security also looks like a tradable commodity at the moment. because it is, relying on a trade-off of resources, of land, all of that, that is owned by communities in our countries. So it is not a simple issue, it's quite complex, but rather than bring it up into the open and have more discussion and consultations, these are again skirted through and done, in different ways. When you're talking about, climate, yes, I think if we have strong feminist foreign policies and we have climate included in it, it would force, or rather, really give impetus onto the country to do better. If our foreign policies were gender responsive, we wouldn't need to have feminist, foreign policies, because, the issues that we grapple with would be covered, but because these policies are so gender neutral, and omitting the issues that we deal with, that we have to have feminist foreign policies. And to me, if you're looking at climate finance, unless that becomes gender responsive, we still won't have all in our communities that are most vulnerable and marginalized being provided with the solutions that they need. And in this case, if we were to have a feminist foreign policy with climate leadership in it, then we would have to act better. Because how can we turn around and offer our leadership on a critical issue that is, for us, to the world, when we don't even look after our own communities?
Excellent. Thank you very much for those. I hate to bring the discussion to a close, but we are 3 minutes past our time limit, and I know people have to get off to the next ones. I just want to say, thank you very much to all of the panelists, to all of our presenters this morning, for the vibrant discussion around, feminist foreign policy and, the continued commitments that all of our governments and other partners have in terms of the Beijing Action Plan. Lopa, talked about it being a political commitment, and we're certainly seeing changing dynamics in the region, not only in the region, but also globally. And I think that the feminist foreign policy agenda is one that will continue to evolve and adapt. And I do encourage all of you to reach out to each other in this room, hopefully have some other conversations to follow up. If you haven't signed up, please do so with the participant list. We'll be circulating a summary of the proceedings today. But with that, I just want to express my deepest thanks to all of our speakers, to Lopa, who had to leave, as well as Ambassador Amarsanaa, who also had to excuse himself, Ambassador Perceval, who provided us with reflections from Latin America, as well as our panelists, Chandy, Nalini, and Alice. Thank you very much for sharing your perspectives, for giving us some opportunities, some possibilities for hope and optimism going forward, while also acknowledging the challenges that we're all facing. And I think that given the current context, not only in this region but also globally, it will require bold and innovative approaches like feminist foreign policy and a real collaborative engagement process through academia, civil society, government partners, private sector partners as well, to continue to push for this and see through those commitments that were made in the Beijing Action Plan. So thank you very much to everyone, for all of our participants online as well. Thank you for joining, and I wish everybody a wonderful rest of the conference.